Welcome to our study of the Bodhisattva Guide, which is His Holiness the Dalai Lama's commentary on the way of the Bodhisattva. There's some of you who've already written some questions, and I will answer them or aspire to answer them at the end of the session. But anyway, please type in your questions as they come up, and the last 15 minutes we'll do some Q&A. So, as always, recognizing the project at hand, which is in the Buddhist context, understanding that all suffering originates with a basic cognitive dysfunction, a basic delusional condition in which we misunderstand our reality, and on the basis of that then spiral into this condition called samsara, then presently cultivating the means for eliminating this delusional condition, which is then the project of cultivating wisdom. We approach this in the way of really three aspects, which is first listening to the teaching of the great sages, those who we take refuge in as unobscured, as possessing an authentic, valid insight into reality. And then on the basis of hearing what they say, which we don't accept uncritically, but also which we hear in terms of something that corresponds to our personal experience. And hence, the second aspect of this process really is recognizing and identifying the relevance of these teachings in terms of our personal experience. So once we establish the validity of the Buddhist teaching and the teachings that we have from the likes of Shantideva, the Dalai Lama, our teachers, and so forth, once we have established the validity, the overall validity of this science, if you like, then through the process of reflection, we identify how this needs to be applied in terms of our personal experience, our personal journey. And this is then the second aspect of cultivating prajna, or wisdom. And then the third aspect is, once we've understood where suffering originates, or where our confusion originates from, and understanding how it can be eliminated, then we engage in the actual integration of this insight beyond just the level of intellectual understanding. And this is then the practice of meditation. So we initially approach the path in terms of rationality, in terms of a good, healthy degree of skepticism and critical thinking. But then once we've established the validity of the path, then we engage through far more than just a commitment in terms of, you could say, our loyalties and allegiances and political commitment and and you could say intellectual appreciation, but we actually engage in an entire path of transformation. Not transformation in the sense of becoming something that we're not, but rather transformation in the sense of uncovering what innately abides as a basic disposition that is not delusional, that is free from obscurations. And this way, the practice is really, or the path is intended to uncover what was always there, what is the abiding, what we could call primordial purity. And this is then the Buddhist path, and we engage in this really with the intention to alleviate the suffering of not just ourselves, but those of the larger community, those with whom we are connected. And particularly in the Mahayana Buddhist context, we actually don't limit that to just a few select persons that we might presently be connected with, but really see this as applying to all living creatures, all sentient life. So this is the intention with which we engage in this practice or this study, and specifically then the present place in which we are, the present place where we are in the text actually highlights this. So, and by the way, the bridge here is somewhere in Germany. I think in a place called Kromlau, and it's called the Devil's Bridge, which I like to think is very apt, since we as Buddhists we're very comfortable with the dark side, especially us how do you say, aspiring tantrikas. The or rather, actually, the entire Buddhist teaching really is very comfortable with the dark side, in the sense that we start off with acknowledging suffering. So like Chögyam Trungpa made a point about, we don't start off with just the love and the light. We very much deal with the truth of our discomfort. And that really becomes the foundation for the inspiration for our journey. It becomes the manure for the path. So, so here's to the Devil's Bridge in Kromlau, Germany. So in the text then, actually before we start the text, and this is His Holiness's, you could say, injunction actually, to just start off with some formal chant. So this first is from the Vinaya, the second is from the Prajnaparamita, and the third is a generic liturgy for taking refuge in developing the mind of enlightenment. Abandon evil doing, practice virtue well, subdue your mind. This is the Buddha's teaching. Like a star, an optical illusion or a flame, a magical illusion, a dewdrop or a bubble, like a dream, a flash of lightning or a cloud. So should one consider all compounded things. In the jewels of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, we take refuge until we attain enlightenment. By the merit of practicing generosity and the like, may we attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the jewels of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, we take refuge until we attain enlightenment. By the merit of practicing generosity and the like, may we attain Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. In the jewels of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, we take refuge until we attain enlightenment. By the merit of practicing generosity and the like, may we attain Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. Okay. So presently, the teaching on the way of the Bodhisattva that His Holiness is delivering comes very much on the basis of Paltrimsh's tradition of explanation, and particularly then, in this case, the teachings by Minya Kunsang Sonam, who then wrote a commentary, apparently the most extensive commentary there is on the way of the Bodhisattva. So, so that's where we have a famous verse, and we often chant this, and it runs: "May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more." And His Holiness says, for those who have not yet generated bodhicitta, the first 3 chapters of the Bodhicharya Avatara explain how to do so. So that's the first 3 chapters really correspond to where it says, may bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be. And then His Holiness says, to prevent bodhicitta from declining, they follow the instructions in the chapters on carefulness, attentiveness, and patience, which is then the line where it says, and where it has arisen, may it never fail. After this, The chapters on endeavor, meditative concentration, and wisdom describe how bodhicitta can be continuously developed. And then that is the last line where it says, but grow and flourish ever more and more. So we have here really a summary of the entire paramita vehicle. And we have, we would say that the teachings on the paramitas, which we generally understand in terms of generosity, discipline, patience, endeavor, meditation, and prajna, are covered in this work. And incidentally, also when we have this liturgy where we say here, by the merit of practicing generosity and the like, we actually mean with those lines there, we actually mean the entire paramita vehicle. Simply just all the six. So really practicing generosity and like just means practicing generosity, etc., i.e. all of the six paramitas. And that's why we would say the six paramitas, they are taught in terms of generosity first, which is, in terms of the way of the Bodhisattva, we would say that there's continual references to generosity throughout the text. And when it then comes to discipline, this is covered in the 2 chapters on carefulness and attentiveness. And incidentally, the Paltra Rinpoche, he would say, among all the teachings on the practice on the nature of the mind, he finds that 4th chapter, carefulness, particularly helpful. Anyway, patience and then endeavor, concentration and wisdom are then described in terms of their dedicated particular chapters. And then His Holiness says, finally, the 10th and concluding chapter discusses how to share and dedicate this bodhicitta that has been generated, protected from decline and increasingly developed. This is how Paltra Rinpoche explained it, and I find it very profound. So once again, with His Holiness's commentary, we're not going to go through the entire work of the Way of the Bodhisattva. It's really just selected verses from the different chapters that His Holiness will comment on. So then, in the Way of the Bodhisattva, it reads, so hard to find the ease and wealth, whereby the aims of beings may be gained. If now I fail to turn it to my profit, how could such a chance be mine again? Okay, 18 characteristics of a human existence. Now these are what we call the eight freedoms and the 10 endowments. So we have presently 8 ways in which we're free from unfavorable conditions, and also we have 10 extraordinary, well, you can say endowments or advantages, 5 of which depend on ourselves and 5 of which depend on the circumstances around us. And these all constitute then these, what we famously actually refer to as the 18 freedoms and endowments. And this is something that we very often contemplate when we recognize the value of the human rebirth. So having this opportunity then, if we fail to use this, when will we have that chance again? So His Holiness says, to be able to practice bodhicitta, which has so many good qualities, we need intelligence, favorable conditions, and in particular, the supreme condition of a human life. A human life is difficult to find and very valuable if we have it. So again, this comes from the Buddhist perspective, in which we see the human life not as a manifestation, or rather something that just comes about through physical components, but as an extraordinary manifestation of our consciousness. So from the Buddhist perspective, as I'm very often repeating, because it really goes against or challenges the assumption basic to our materialist science, which is that our experience is something that emerges on the basis of physical or non-conscious conditions. neurobiological systems. And from the Buddhist point of view, we would say the basis, the ground of all our reality is consciousness. And while this consciousness in itself also is free of something that can be objectified and possesses inherent existence, etc., nevertheless, our present condition, which is then an experience of individuality, an experience of realm and a place and so on, is primarily constructed through our consciousness, our psychology. And it's on the basis of that that we find ourselves embodied in countless different ways, which is what we describe as the realms of samsara. And that's where the present condition of having been born a human is seen to be extremely rare. And on top of that, then, on top of having been born a human, then also to have the fortune to have the conditions to free ourselves from confusion, to have come across the Buddhist teaching, is seen as being immensely rare and immensely valuable. So that's why His Holiness says we should not waste our lives, but make good use of these favorable conditions. And then the text, the way the Bodhisattva reads, just as on a dark night, black with clouds, the sudden lightning glares, and all is clearly shown. Likewise, rarely, through the Buddha's power, virtue's thoughts rise, brief and transient, in the world. Virtue thus is weak, and always evil is of great and overwhelming strength. Except for perfect bodhicitta, what other virtue is there that can lay it low? So we have to humbly acknowledge that as long as we're caught in this delusional condition of essentially operating with the confused condition of the samsaric mind, even though we might have say a higher rebirth and be in a place of comfort and so forth, and not necessarily stuck in the anguished experience of the lower realms, even so, there is always this condition of thinking in terms of I. And with the condition of I, then there's always the struggle to achieve what it is that we want and to ward off what it is that we dislike. And in this toxic condition, without anybody being good or bad in any way, but nevertheless subject to this conditioning, then there's predominantly the practice of the kleshas, the practice of the afflicted mind, negative emotions, or whatever we might choose to call them, on the basis of the basic delusion of self. Then there is the condition of the afflicted mind, if you like, which then drives actions. And these actions then, as we lay them down, become what we call karmic patterning. It's on the basis of that then that you could say, perpetuate a rather repetitive pattern, which is essentially founded on this self-centering and the pain of our existence. And we would say, in terms of samsara, then the higher realms, they're not that, they're sparsely populated, and the lower realms are rather densely populated. So we do predominantly in samsara have this situation of being afflicted with few virtuous thoughts. And so the occasionally emerging of something that goes beyond just our self-centering, that looks beyond that, is something that is weak, it's rare, and this is almost predictable in terms of our samsaric situation. So this also applies when we look at the world, and we very often are, you could say, disappointed, if not disgusted or appalled by the poor decisions that are being made in terms of the political arena and in terms of our interaction with our fellow creatures. Then in some way this is predictable. This is the nature of the samsaric condition. So that's where presently we appreciate this unique opportunity we have to actually have this constructive angle on wishing to go beyond our confusion, wishing to extend ourselves to others. And that's where the cultivation of bodhicitta is recognized as really being the remedy for this affliction. So that's with the appreciation of this key value of bodhicitta, which is the intention to establish all sentient beings at the level of enlightenment, and also break through on the basis of essentially breaking through our primitive beliefs, our flawed assumptions about reality. We then engage in the path. So His Holiness says, because of our past karma, it is very rare and difficult to have a positive mind, while it is all too easy to have negative thoughts, since this is what we have been used to. So we should nurture positive thoughts, such as devotion to the Buddhas and compassion for beings. It is through this that we develop bodhicitta. So temporarily, of course, we're very much dependent on what we find pleasurable, and that's where it's very helpful to cultivate the condition really for well-being, for happiness, and essentially what we could call merit, which is really establishing the conditions that connect us with the path of awakening. And so within that, we then connect on the basis of appreciating the example of those who are awake, and also sympathizing with the cause of sentient beings that are suffering. So His Holiness said it's through this that we develop bodhicitta. He says there's nothing as powerful as bodhicitta for purifying our negative actions and obscurations, for attaining temporary and ultimate happiness, and for helping other beings. So our journey consists of this purification to create the conditions for both temporary happiness, ultimately freedom, and also in order for us to benefit others. He says, if we wish to free ourselves and others from the suffering of samsara, then we should develop bodhicitta. As we do so, its immeasurable qualities are such that even though we may still appear to be ordinary beings subject to suffering, we will be proclaimed as heirs of the Buddhas, worthy of veneration by human and celestial beings. So of course we don't do this because we ultimately aspire to be venerated, but we are doing this with recognition of the situation that we're all in. And already at this point, even though we might not be perfect, we might not be great bodhisattvas, then nevertheless or we might not be particularly advanced, or you say we might not have gone very far on the path, then still already at this point, as soon as we develop this intention, we are then viewed as bodhisattvas. This is according to particularly the tradition of Shantideva, this is according to what we call the Madhyamika lineage. So that's where some traditions, they'll say you have to have realized the first bhumi to be considered a bodhisattva. Then in the lineage of the Madhyamika and Shantideva, then from the moment that we generate this thought, I wish to serve other sentient beings, then already there we actually at this point we can take the ordination or the bodhisattva vow. So His Holiness says our bodhicitta may not yet be spontaneous. It's still something we have to fabricate. Nevertheless, once we have embraced and begun to develop this extraordinary attitude, whatever positive actions we do, prostration, circumambulation, recitations, or acts of generosity, while not appearing any different, will bring greatly increased results. So if we do this from, you could say, sort of an ordinary habitual perspective, that's of course great, but the moment that we do this imbued with this courage and strength and, you could say, psychological wealth of bodhicitta, then anything we do really has far greater impact. His Holiness says, bodhicitta itself has two aspects, aspiration and application. Aspiration is simply wishing to attain enlightenment for all beings, the desire to pursue the path. Application begins with taking the vow of bodhicitta and promising to put it into action. Aspiration is like simply wanting to go somewhere. Application is actually going. So this is also how Shantideva in the text, he defines these two, aspiration and application. Wanting to go somewhere and the journey itself. The good qualities of even aspiration bodhicitta are immense. How much more so are the qualities of those of one who has taken the vow. So this actually refers to a very concrete ritual, which is the taking of the Bodhisattva vow. So this can be done, of course, in an informal context, as we might do it in terms of our daily practice and so on. But it really initially is associated with a formal receiving of the Bodhisattva vow from a teacher. So this can be quite, say, an elaborate ritual ceremony, and it's really intended to be a place in which there's a shift in our attitude towards ourselves and the world. His Holiness says, from the moment the vow is taken, whatever a bodhisattva does, whether walking or sleeping, will create great merit simply through the sheer power of the intention. And if there is great merit in wanting to relieve one being of a single discomfort, need one mention the endless benefit of wishing to help innumerable beings? So this is also where we talk about the unbounded or the measureless attitudes. For example, we talk about the 4 Brahma Viharas, which are kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity, which is universal for all the Buddhist paths. But in the Mahayana, these are referred to as the 4 measureless because they're not just psychological attitudes that emerge, as you could say, a property of the path, but it's something which is directed towards the infinitude of infinite, innumerable sentient beings. So His Holiness said, it's said that to think negatively about such a bodhisattva has extremely serious consequences. We should therefore take great care to protect ourselves from this sort of fault and consider others as our teachers. So that's why we should have this, we should give others the benefit of the doubt. They might appear as rather annoying or in some ways sort of not exactly what we would want, but at the same time we would say we never know who is a bodhisattva and who isn't. So this of course also applies to teachers and so forth. He says, and we should never, without a specific reason, point out other people's faults. As the omniscient Gendun Drupa, which is actually the first Dalai Lama, said, be grateful to all beings and regard all practitioners with pure vision. Subdue the enemy within. And this is a very real project, actually. We have that continually. We have annoyance with all beings in general, and also sort of, if you're a Buddhist practitioner, you're surrounded by this motley crew of others, the Sangha, which very often actually requires that we exercise a little bit of patience and certainly pure vision. So, so that we have, in this sense, we have a very real challenge, and that's where Gendun Drupa says we should be grateful, sustain pure vision, and subdue the enemy within. And this is not a sort of a concrete enemy as such, but it's really just a flawed assumption that can actually be relatively easily dealt with. Okay, let's just see what it says here. Gendun Drupa, 1391 to 1474, was first in the line of reincarnations who subsequently, during the life of the third, received the title of the Dalai Lama. He's just sort of retroactively the first Dalai Lama. Okay. So in this way, we've covered the first chapter of the Way of the Bodhisattva. So now, then, and so this is really, His Holiness has just selected a few verses from that chapter, which we've now covered. Offering and purification. According to the tradition of the Buddha Dharma, training the mind is a gradual process. We purify ourselves by getting rid of our biggest defects first, and we develop good qualities by expanding on the few we already have. Aryadeva, Nagarjuna's principal disciple, said, "First be rid of evil, then be rid of self, finally be rid of thoughts. Wise is the one who knows this." Now that is true. We generally in the Buddhist path talk of this gradual path, but it's also really important for us, particularly in the present modern context, to just identify some of the lineages of the Mahayana. And there is generally the lineages that we talk about in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, which are the lineages that come from respectively Nagarjuna and Asanga, the lineages of Madhyamaka and Yogacharya. But we also have a third lineage, which also comes from Nagarjuna and which traveled to China with Bodhidharma. And that is referred to the absolute lineage and the absolute Nyingbu Döngi Jiba, which is, yes, the absolute lineage of the essence. And that's what became known as Chan. And the Chan approach comes really from the point of view of the ultimate insight into the lack of inherent existence of reality. And that became really the approach of Bodhidharma when he presented Buddhism in China, which already had existed there for a long time. So in Chinese Buddhism, you have plenty of emphasis on the gradual path. The accumulation of merit and so forth is very well known. But Bodhidharma introduced this path of Zen, which was very much, or Chan rather, which was then simply just settling into the condition of non-conceptuality. And this tradition spread in China, and it is really the tradition that then eventually traveled to Japan and became Zen. So this is also an approach, and this generally is has a different flavor than the Indo-Tibetan general Indo-Tibetan approach, which is the gradual path. And the Tibetans, they opted to adopt the gradual path primarily. And hence, when we look at the style and the flavor of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, particularly, I guess we could talk about Tibetan Buddhism, and then the style of Chan and Zen, a little bit different in their methodologies, obviously, but we shouldn't also forget that in China, particularly, then you also had this gradual approach. The reason really being the Tibetans adopted this is that they would say that there's a danger of just settling into a sort of a condition of non-thought that could be not directed towards enlightenment, but simply just leading to a vacuous condition of mind. So that's why the Tibetan opted for the gradual path, seeing this as being much more solid, much more practical. At the same time, also, many Tibetan teachers have recognized, of course, the value of Chan and Zen, the Zen approach. So it's not as if there necessarily is how to say, a lack of appreciation for these approaches. But one really takes the gradual path very much takes into takes into consideration the relative experience that we have as humans in an ordinary world with a sense of identity, with our particular karmic dispositions and so forth. And that's where bringing that onto the path in terms of the skillful means of the path, then we work with these conditions. And that is then where we start off with the acknowledgement of suffering and the conditions of the 5 skandhas and so forth, the actual experience we have as ordinary persons, not yet enlightened, and making that part of the journey. So that's where we generally, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, we train the mind in this sense of the gradual path. So we have this in all the various traditions, regardless. And this is then essentially constituted in terms of two aspects. One is eliminating confusion and revealing or uncovering realization. So that's where His Holiness says we purify ourselves by getting rid of our biggest defects first, and we develop good qualities by expanding on the few that we already have. So this is where then we talk about first be rid of evil, then be rid of self, finally be rid of thoughts. Wise is the one who knows this. So the first is dealing with our present neurosis, then seeing the nature of this, the foundations for this neurosis or our neurotic actions, and then finally be able to engage with this absence of confusion through simply settling into the natural condition, free from the conceptual constructs. So His Holiness says, this is the path that a wise person has to take. First, be rid of evil. To attain ultimate omniscience and to be able to benefit all beings, it's necessary to have a human life, which is the supreme support for progressing toward enlightenment. To obtain a human life, which is a fortunate rebirth, it's necessary to avoid the non-virtuous actions that will lead to birth in the lower realms of samsara. Then be rid of self. Having forsaken negative actions, we have to abandon their causes, which are negative emotions, meaning the kleshas, our neurosis, or the sort of afflicted conditions of the confused mind. The only antidote to these is the wisdom that knows the non-reality of things. According to Nagarjuna and his spiritual descendants, the root of negative emotions is the ignorance of believing that phenomena are real. So when we say believing phenomena are real, this is both in terms of the subjective dimension of the self of person and also the objective dimension of the self of phenomena. So His Holiness says, this has many aspects, gross and subtle. In order to dissolve the concept of substantiality, however, we must first abandon belief in the existence of the individual as an entity or self. But that is not simply to have a vague grasp of this question. It's necessary to refine our understanding and insight and to gain that subtle wisdom whereby the notion of self is eradicated. So this is where really the operative word is vague, because it's not going to help us to just have some vague idea about what selflessness means as some sort of condition of just being easygoing or and so forth. It's necessary that we actually have very precise understanding exactly of how it is absolutely impossible for us to possess inherently a self, and that's why we need to identify how we are delusional, how we're assuming that there's something there which actually isn't there. And that can't be done in terms of us just sort of tagging along with a sort of vague sense of maybe not. There has to be an absolute definite establishment of that. And that is what we call establishing the view with certainty. And that's why there's a lot of emphasis in this, you could say, rational, skeptical, cynical approach of Buddhism that investigates our assumptions. So that's where we need to sort of engage with the teachings that we have in the Prajnaparamita, in the Majjhimaka, and so forth. Then we say finally be rid of thoughts. To attain enlightenment, we have to remove not only negative emotions and their causes, but also the habits that obscure knowledge. Once we annihilate these obscurations, we attain omniscience. The path leading to this is the wisdom that understands that things have no reality. So that's where we initially establish the view with certainty, and then we engage in this process of initially having seen the flaw of our assumptions, we then actually effectively begin to eliminate our habitual allegiance to these deluded habitual patterns through the practice of the path in terms of meditation and in terms of post-meditation in everyday life. So His Holiness says, through meditation, we can establish firmly the view of emptiness. This extraordinary view, impregnated with compassion and combined with the accumulation of merit, completely destroys the veils that obscure knowledge. The purpose of such meditation is to act as the antidote to our own negative emotions and their traces, and indirectly to the obscurations of all other beings. Once this goal has been achieved, all concepts, including that of emptiness, must be abandoned. So this initial view that we have in the Mahayana is the view of emptiness, but we would say this is understood in terms of the two truths. So we would say the view of the Mahayana is that of the two truths, of course, understanding how relatively we definitely have our familiar everyday life, and yet understanding how this doesn't possess any inherent existence. And that is what we call the two truths, relative and absolute truth. And then we engage in this path on the basis of relating to our habitual way of perceiving the world and working with these conditions, which is what we call the accumulation of merit, and also understanding the actual nature or ultimate reality of this, which is then what we call the accumulation of merit. Sorry, the accumulation of wisdom. And this then leads us ultimately to the goal of what we call the two kayas, the Dhammakaya of wisdom and the Rupakaya that manifests out of compassion. But what we then do in terms of the path is then engaging in meditation essentially as the antidote to our confusion and what comes out of our confusion, namely then the neurotic actions. And this is something that purifies ourselves, and implicitly also this begins also to affect our interaction with others. And we would say this also benefits others. Us practicing also benefits others. So we should of course understand this, and that's why His Holiness says we should understand this in terms of the path, really in terms of a remedy, and also the view of even say emptiness is just a remedy, and that's where ultimately also we abandon any concepts, including also the concept of emptiness. So His Holiness says, quoting Aryadeva, then he says, wise is the one who knows this. This refers to those who know the different stages of the path and its essential points, and who would practice them in the correct order so that they attain full realization. So we possess, luckily, a heritage of the Buddhist teaching, which consists not just of a body of knowledge, but also a lineage of those who have realization. Trungpa Rinpoche, he refers to these two kinds of Dharma as what has been heard and what has been experienced. So in terms of the teaching, these of course are valid, and this is what we need ourselves to verify the validity of, but we also have then a living Dharma that comes down to us through the lineage of teachers. And that's where we have the notion of those who possess wisdom. So he says, it's very important, therefore, to know how to practice properly and not be satisfied with a vague or partial knowledge of the path. The Bodhicharya Avatara gives a complete explanation of the whole path. Please study it with the intention of bringing the infinity of sentient beings who have been our parents to enlightenment. So this is where we engage with this study with not just the intention of us doing something Buddhist or our little private nirvana project, but really on the basis of looking at the world and seeing how much suffering there is, how much fear, how much insecurity, how much anguish and pain we sentient beings all endure. And of course, that doesn't just mean the human race, but all beings everywhere. See here, see chapter 8. Traditionally, there are two methods. 4, a traditional method of developing compassion and concern for other beings regarding them as one's own parents. So that is where, again, we come back to a vision really which extends beyond the materialist view and takes into account then how we've been related to others over countless lifetimes. Okay, let's see if there's some questions. What are negative emotions? It sounds dualistic. Isn't it taught that all emotions are suffering? Well, look, we're going to come across a lot of teachings that sound all sorts of ways that might confuse us. And that's where we always have to sort of give the Buddha or the various teachers the benefit of the doubt and saying, yeah, it might sound dualistic, but you know, might be there might be some wisdom in it in some way. So generally, all the various teachings, of course, they don't really conflict, but they might take on a different language. And of course, when we're talking about the negative emotions, we're talking about the cause of suffering. Of course, if we're tantrikas, then there is no suffering. There's just bliss, and all the negative emotions, they are causes of bliss. And so that's where the perspective really is different in the different yanas or different vehicles. But we would say that negative emotions is just a translation of kleshas. So yes, emotions, negative emotions, they're sort of synonymous in this context. But of course, we can sometimes talk about positive emotions in terms of bodhicitta and so forth. But again, even positive emotions, of course, also then are dualistic phenomena. But this is, of course, when we're relating simply to relative truth. Anyway, this translation of kleshas is something that translators they struggle with, or not struggle, but there are many different translations. So sometimes we have afflictions, we have conflicting emotions, we have, Trungpa Rinpoche would say, neurosis, and so we have various terms for these. You know, we have also destructive emotions and so on. What are the 7 good qualities of the higher realms? I would say they might be what we call I would say probably it's faith, discipline, generosity, listening to the teachings, how do you say, decorum, shame, and wisdom. I think that's what they are. See if that if that adds up to 7. Yeah. Just to let you know, there is no camera operating. Really? No, there should be. The camera should be operating. Just that stunning photo on screenshot. Can hear you clearly. All right. Yeah, I think the camera should be on. Hello, Jakob La. Hello, La. Welcome to. Do sages feel emotions? Sages don't have ordinary, what we would say, self-centered emotions, but sages would have compassion. And that's where, and also sages would have the enlightened qualities like insight and so forth. So there's you could say, there's the liberation, the liberated psychology, or the liberated dimension of enlightenment, in which there are qualities such as compassion and so forth. But emotions normally are associated with the neurosis of the self. It sounds like at every stage we need the guidance of a realized being. Can we develop on the path without a guru? Because of our present isolation, there are little chances of meeting a teacher. What practices are best to do in the meantime? Well, we live in a world in which there are realized beings, and we can connect with them in many ways. Of course, it's lovely if we can hang out and spend a couple of weeks with Guruji, you know, just us and, you know, our select friends and in a loving sort of environment. But, you know, that doesn't happen that often, even under the best of circumstances. And so there are many ways that we connect with the teachers. Sometimes it might just be a short meeting. Sometimes it might just be over YouTube. Sometimes it might be from reading the teachings, studying the teachings, so on. So we are, you could say we are, particularly then in this present context, we are connecting with a lineage and a culture and a landscape in which there is the presence of realized beings. So we continually recollect the teacher, and I'm always quoting my friend Eric Pema Kunsang, who went before Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche and said, "You know, Rinpoche, I think more about you when you're not here," and and that's kind of true, because you could spend your time with a great teacher and then you're just wondering what's for lunch and who's that down there and so on. So that's where um, the, the real way of invoking the teacher is really just recollecting the teacher. And that is where all along the lines in the various Buddhist traditions, we have this practice called Buddha Anusmriti or Triratna Anusmriti, which is to just remember the teacher. Just bring to mind the image of the teacher, the atmosphere of the teacher. So that's where we practice for example, the various ways in which we recollect the teachers, the Buddha practice, the Guru Yoga, and so on. Okay, the camera is on. Okay, good. All right. All right. I think the camera is on, right? Yeah. I think we're good. Anyway, nothing, if camera wasn't on, you wouldn't be missing much, I believe me. Okay, so feel free to ask any questions. Preferably related to the text, though. Mm-hmm.
Prerequisite is to see everything as illusionary, and yet the sense of our own validation and the rest of it is to do with seeing things as solid and real.
Mm-hmm.
How does that start to dissolve into a higher way of seeing?
So the question is, how do we dissolve our perception of things as solid? Looking at them and seeing that they are made up of different things. So for example, I label this lamp, but I do this on the basis of there's several things that actually constitute this lamp. So I label it as one, but in fact it's made up of several things. And each of these parts, they are not the lamp. So we begin to approach this in terms of simply just analyzing and seeing that everything there is made up of, is composite, is made up of various conditions. So that's how we begin to dissolve. We can see that we label it as one. This is a hand. But then if I begin to look into it, this is made up of of different fingers. It's made out of sinews, tissues, flesh, blood, etc., bones, and so on. Then we begin to dissolve the assumption that this label, this identity that we give to it, as solid. So that's the homework. Try that. That's what we do. So that's where we first hear the teachings, because we've heard it many times, that things appear as unitary, and yet they're not unitary. They appear as being, having a self, but we cannot find any self. We see them as being permanent, but they don't have any permanence. So this is, we so often hear that. And that's where we actually need to go, what? And then we need to use it. We need to think about it in the day. We need to say, that's what the Buddha said. Let me take that with me, and now I'm going to investigate using that. So the approach here is to see that things, they're made up of different things, that they're impermanent, and they don't possess that independent nature that we attribute to them. That's what we need to do. And this we can't do on just hearing it and sort of go, it's a question of actually us doing this in everyday life, maybe 10 times every day in different situations. Shame. Can you say a bit more about how this? Okay. Now the questions are coming in. All right. Can you say how about this is a virtue in this concept? Yes. Nowadays we talk a lot about shame as in shaming and as being something that's very negative, and it's sort of it's seen, essentially shame is understood in terms of an aggressive, an action of aggression that we throw at others, possibly. And what we mean in the Buddhist context when we talk about shame as a virtue, it's really just the integrity of ourselves. When we actually have, you could say, an inner decorum. Decorum is the other thing where we think more about the others. We think about how do the others perceive us. But what we mean with shame is really this awareness of ourselves, our own integrity, our own dignity. So that's the virtue, because that's where we essentially go beyond hypocrisy. So that's where you could say we are consistently true to ourselves. So that's what we mean with the word shame. It's something that, as one of these terms also, that you could say translators struggle with an awareness about how the modern conversation approaches the issue of shame. Yeah. But it is essentially something that definitely constitutes a power within ourselves, and this quality of dignity and internal integrity, that we can look ourselves in the mirror and be comfortable with who we are. Not related to the text, what do you recommend as a Buddhist primer for someone who's interested in learning about Buddhism and is intellectual in orientation? I always recommend the works of Chögyam Trungpa, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, The Myth of Freedom. But there's, it depends also on individuals. Sometimes if people are more academic, actually, I recommend a book called The Tree of Enlightenment by a wonderful person, a blind Sanskrit scholar who lived in India for many years and was a student of His Holiness Akha Trinzen, Peter Della Santina. And he wrote a book called The Tree of Enlightenment, warmly recommended. And then, of course, you have other works like Tongsa Gyalmen Khyentse, which is What Makes You Not a Buddhist, and Tralik Rinpoche's The Essence of Buddhism. Is it a conflict to practice bodhicitta with the self when in fact we are trying to get rid of the conception of self? Good question. This is the skill of bodhicitta. This is the skill of the gradual approach, that it takes into consideration that we presently do have a conception of self. And that's why we talk about relative bodhicitta and absolute bodhicitta. Relative bodhicitta is very much thinking in terms of self and others. And it's the notion of generating kindness and compassion for others, recognizing our relationship with others and really making that a vehicle for the journey. Thank you, J and K. Okay. Likewise, rarely through the Buddha's power, virtuous likewise rarely, through the Buddha's power, virtuous thoughts arise. Does this refer to an external powerful Buddha in the sky? The inner guru, both not. Well, I'm sorry. Actually, in the Buddha's teaching, we see the Buddha as somebody who's a conduit, or you could say someone who's there, just like a teacher that essentially shows us something. So that's why we appreciate the teacher. But like the Buddha said, he can't free us. So then we of course can talk about an external powerful Buddha, but not in the sky. Very much a Buddha who walked this earth. And the Buddha who walked this earth was teaching us something about ourselves. And so when we talk about the Buddha's power, then it can be, of course, be through the aspiration of the Buddha, but particularly it's on the basis of the inner Buddha. It's on the basis of our own, essentially, merit. Not just good karma, because good karma could, take us to, a life of luxury and distraction, but merit enables us to connect to the Buddhist path, and that's where it's on the basis of you could say, the presence of enlightenment as it exists in the universe. Yes, we could refer to it as, you say, the nature of reality, and our own aspirations to uncover this truth or this reality. So you could say the enlightenment exists as the nature, as the reality of nature, if you like, and that's where the Buddha and other Buddhas who have realized this, they appear external to us. They have realization, we don't. So we're very grateful to those who will teach us, just like great piano players. They will teach those who aspire to play piano. But of course, those who aspire to play piano are going to have to do it themselves. And so eventually they connect with their own, you could say, disposition and talent. So that's where we have then you could say, the Nirmanakaya, or the external Buddha, the manifest Buddha that points to the inner Buddha, the Dharmakaya, and you could say it's through the conditions of enlightenment that these two come together. In relation to abandoning my concept of self, okay, hold on. In relation to abandoning my concept of self, I can see that my mind, body, and speech are constantly changing, and there is no fixed concept of me. But I have great difficulty in letting go of the need to protect this conglomeration of bodies, mind, body, and speech, because of a deep level, I fear this self all coming to an end, dying. Even though I accept the Buddha teachings, I'm still clinging to continuing on in Sukhavati's pure land. I'm taking comfort from that. How do I get over this clinging in duality, wanting to exist as something on some level after death? There's only one way, and that is through the practice of the path. And this is where we through the practice of the path, we see through this delusion that we have. But it's not going to come just like that. So we're all practitioners. We're all humbly recognizing that we face the challenges you described there, where we can see there is no self, and yet we cling to it. And that's where we need to not just be thinking about this, we need to just apply the methods of the path. Meta-analysis, which establishes the truth of this, which is really essential. And then, on the basis of that, settling the mind. And that's where the normal, naive fixating on the narratives of duality, we begin to let go of them. And that's the process that we need to undertake. And that's where the Buddhist teaching goes beyond just, you could say, being philosophy or being belief, but very much is a journey in terms of an actual practice. So you are no different from all of you. Everything you say there applies to myself. And we're simply just going to have to keep on practicing. And this is, of course, as we can look at the lives of the great sages of the past, it's not something that we just sort of do as a secondary project. It really has to be a radical engagement. I think we long to have a physically close relationship with our masters because of our habitual way of thinking, but I reckon we can be very close and guided by our masters by listening to their teachings and advice online and reading their books. Yes, all of that we can agree on. However, in Vajrayana, there's an emphasis in having a guru pointing out the nature of mind, which I'm not sure if it's possible to do online. Yeah, that's something that requires a personal presence. That's true. Yeah. Shame, can that be understood as self-decency? I guess so. Yeah. And so I guess we could talk about shame, and sometimes we talk about shame and embarrassment. Ngotsa and Tlir in Tibetan Dharma language, where one is decency with regards to self, our own sort of respect for ourselves, and then other decency, the respect that we have from the side of others. Can we say that shame has a connotation of purification? I guess so. It can be part of the incentive for our purification. It's where we recognize that something needs to be done. Is positive shame in a Buddhist context similar to having conscience, perhaps? Yes, that's what it would imply, yeah. Is it correct to say that a Buddha is a state, or this is just one of the ways to explain what Buddha is? Thank you. Well, we would say it's our basic disposition. On an ultimate level, we would say Buddha is the awakening to our basic reality. So it's not just a state, but it's the primordial condition that's basic to all life. And to awaken to that primordial condition and to, you could say, fully make flourish the qualities of this condition is then the properties of awakening or becoming a Buddha. Does anyone know where we can buy a paper copy of the Tree of Enlightenment in Australia? No, it hasn't been. Well, actually, a friend of mine some years ago just sort of made a lot of prints of the PDF. And remember, we were in a retreat where this person very kindly gave everyone a copy. So, I mean, we're just going to have to print it out. If you print it out in A5. It's very large print. So when you print it, if you print it in A4, which it is by default, it's good for people my age, but the rather large print. And in this life, I feel the need to protect the conglomeration of my body and my mind from being emotionally hurt or actually injured. How do I deal with that real fear in this life? Again, through the practice, because we're all like that. We all, you're not unique. It's not as if we're a failed Buddhist if we feel the need to protect the conglomeration of body and my mind. So that's where we're all like that. So that's where this is what we need to humbly recognize, and that is why we practice Lojong. That's why we practice in order to really not just have the appreciation of the wonder of that, but also to actually really integrate that. And that's where we need to have first an insight into the validity of this, and then the actual endurance of practicing and bringing, particularly when we talk about emotional hurt, being injured and all of that, what we call bringing adverse circumstances onto the path. And that's why we need to part from our habitual ways of seeing things where we react to others, see others as being the fault of our suffering and so on, and actually begin to develop a wider perspective that understands the perspective of others, takes into consideration the reality of things rather than how we construct things from our particular vantage point. Okay, all right. Well, some questions did come after all. So, okay, one last one. Isn't the self-care of the conglomeration the actual vehicle of bodhicitta? Once we contextualize the truth with our conglomeration ecology interconnected. Yeah. This is definitely the starting point. Yeah, very much, yes. Okay. Thank you for joining us in this practice. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you.